How are you?
I'm good. And first, I have to say thank you. I can tell my husband not everybody left when I came on the stage.
Oh my gosh. Well, everyone's excited to hear from you. And we were just hearing from the Duchess about everything she's doing for the holiday season and how important that is for her brand. That's something you two have in common.
Yeah, it turns out holiday is kind of I'm so excited we have something in common. Holiday is kind of a big deal. And, joking aside, our focus is just maniacally on the customer. And you want this to be like a joyful, fun, you want to help people deliver their holiday dreams. And so we think about it a little less as like what product, people always ask me what product's going to be hot. I'm not sure it matters. All that matters is what the recipient thinks. And we have so many ways in which I think we can make you the cool gift giver, which is something I always want to be. So
that's a fun, whether you want jam or whether you want some new technology.
I mean, maybe it is your jam.
Maybe it's both. That is so true. Well, that was a good one.
Thanks.
Okay, you have such great insight on the state of the world right now. And I think if any company was impacted by tariffs over this year, it has been Best Buy.
Yeah.
So walk us through what these past months have been like for you. Where did your experience, Best Buy's exposure to tariffs start, and where is it today?
Yeah, so maybe some context setting. We're in an interesting position. We are actually a brand of other brands. And the consumer electronics supply chain is a very different one. Less than 10% of all the consumer electronics in the world are manufactured in the US. So it's an incredibly global supply chain with some of the world's biggest companies. And our position is here in the US, which is the largest market. We are obviously the last man standing, or woman standing, I guess as it is, in the consumer electronics industry. And so when we entered the year, about 55% of products, as we could tell, were manufactured in China. That has already shifted to 30 to 35%, with another 25% coming through Mexico and the US, and then the remainder from a variety of other countries. And so everything in some way, shape, or form since March, in essence, has been impacted by some kind of tariff. And I think if you take a bigger step back, in COVID, we learned some really interesting lessons. There's 85,000 people who work at Best Buy. They can't be worried every day about the ups and downs of geopolitical policy. And so how do you create some just like light post moments? And there are just 3 guideposts we're using. 1, stay anchored in the facts and take action. Don't worry about the hyperbole. Go fast, be urgent, be clear, be convicted, make decisions. The second is to provide context. It can be very easy to want to just kind of do things under the cover of night. Our people deserve to understand why we're making the decisions we are, and we are incredibly transparent. And then finally, this isn't just something that you try to live through. You come out of this a vibrant company. You come out of it actually with more capabilities and better partnerships, and that's what we're really focused on.
Do you feel you're there today?
I mean, 5 minutes ago, maybe. I don't think it's a there question. One of the things that's really important to me is building a company that's resilient. So this shouldn't be about, can you navigate this particular situation? The question is the company operating in a resilient way, and therefore whatever happens, it will live far beyond tariffs or far beyond AI or far beyond the coronavirus or. And so I think about it less as a destination and more about the muscles that we need to build to continue to navigate in what I think will just continue to be a volatile environment.
What do you do as a leader to make that possible, to make sure that that workforce of 85,000 people is not taking that on, and that you are the one taking on that burden and deciding what those moments are where they do need to be engaged?
I think it's always a question of what do you share in terms of urgency and what do you hold in terms of urgency. Part of the way we're navigating this is, again, similar to how we navigated the pandemic, a small SWAT team of people who are thinking 24/7 about how you navigate the tariff situation and global politics in general. Not everybody needs to be doing that, but everyone else needs to be really clear about confidently how we're navigating, confidently how we come out the other side, and what our position is in the marketplace. And so we just had our holiday leadership meeting. We had 1,500 people, all of our general managers, and that was all about the unique culture of Best Buy. What makes us special? what makes us special to our customers, what makes it an amazing place to work. You keep people focused on what they can control and use the expertise of few to ensure you keep the many focused.
So in addition to tariffs from where you sit, you also have such an incredible view into the state of the entire economy, not just the consumer economy. So let's talk about that macro environment. Give us the rundown. You've said it's uneven. What are you seeing today?
I mean, uneven should be the word of the century. And it's hard because this consumer conversation becomes the consumer as a monolith. And if there was ever a time in my career where it's been about very different behaviors depending on the consumer you're talking about, it is now. In general, we've used very similar language for the better part of 18 months. A more resilient consumer than we thought, who continues to respond when they have a need or when there's really interesting innovation. But they are very value focused. And by value, I mean, it doesn't always mean they're looking for the cheapest. They're looking for how do I fulfill my need in a way that matches my budget. And so as it relates to the tariff conversation, I realize in consumer electronics, this is all about breadth. So it's not like an egg. If you go buy an egg, you know exactly how much an egg costs week after week after week. You haven't bought a computer for probably 4 or 5 years. And since then, the whole assortment has changed. Last year, we had 45 Copilot Plus computers. This year, we have 145. What you need is just help navigating what's the right device for my price point. And that, for our consumers, is what we're seeing gravitate. Definitely, we're seeing some dispersion between the high-income earners and the low-income earners. And I think, again, if I just level up, that is probably what keeps me up at night most. You went from, call it 30% of GDP spend coming from the lower-income consumer pre-pandemic. Now you're talking about something materially less than that. I mean, it was 30%, I'm sorry, the high-income consumer. Now it's 60%. And that reliance on the high-income consumer, while it makes it feel like there's resiliency in the overall market, that's an issue because your lower-income consumers are really struggling.
So are high earners holding up the economy right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of data points that would say that is where the spend is happening. And a lot of the other indicators, whether it is credit lines and the level of credit, delinquencies, whether it is the inability to find housing or food discrepancies, a lot of that is impacting the lower income consumer to a much greater extent.
And you said that keeps you up at night. Like, talk about that more. What exactly about that keeps you up at night?
I think it's any time the entire economy is heavily reliant on a small, narrow population of people, that is not good for the long-term health of the economy. And so I think again, in our business, what we're trying to keep an eye on and then make sure we assort for is whatever your budget is, how can we make sure we have something that will cater to you? So that the answer isn't, no, I can't afford anything. The answer is, no, we can get you that like very entry point, price point SKU that'll work for your child going to high school who needs a computer in order to be able to be in high school.
I want to remind everyone you have the opportunity to ask questions of Corie. So if you have any, start thinking now and please raise your hand. Not only is the economy uneven, there's also all these conflicting signals. So when you're looking across housing, employment, consumer confidence, which ones do you rely on? What do you turn to for the answers right now, if anything?
Yes, we use all of them. And one of the greatest joy is I'm a learner by heart, and we were talking about, especially with AI as a backdrop, this ability to unlearn and then relearn. We actually were talking with our board about at least Caputo's here as a Seema Sistani. And this concept of how you constantly unlearn and then relearn is going to be incredibly important, I think, to all of us. So one of the greatest joys of this job is how many chances I get to learn. It is something that fuels me. So I get to spend time with economists. And when we sit down with an economist from JP Morgan or Citi, it's 90 minutes of all those metrics. And what you're trying to do, or what I'm trying to do, is take this immense amount of data, this disparate set of metrics, turn it into what I think that means for how we need to show up for the consumer. Because I'm not trying to predict the future. That is a useless task at this point. What I am trying to figure out is how do we best position and then again, create resiliency where I'm maybe starting to see some cracks, or I think we need to be positioned slightly differently.
And when those metrics seem to contradict each other, is there one that you turn to over the others?
And I think that's why it can't be in the job of predicting the future or using a perfect set. AI is great. Even AI can't kick out, like I can ask chat, what's going to happen in the next 6 months, and chat's very confused right now on that one.
Oh my God, maybe it's not up to date. I think we have a question up here if we have a microphone available.
Thank you for asking a question.
Yes.
I love the fact that you said you love to learn. That's what the question is about. As you look at all your peer groups around the globe, because the whole world is a bit of a mess, this is not just US or North America, what have you seen that's interesting that you said, I'm going to copy that? Something that somebody has done that's profound that you thought copying is the best form of compliment?
It's maybe not as much copy. What I'm interested in, to your question about learning, is not just AI for the sake of AI, but especially in consumer retail boxes like ours. Where does the human element matter so incredibly much, and you're actually going to double down on it, versus where can you make those human-like interactions? I mean, I think one of the most ironic things about generative AI is that it is the most technical set of specifications we've ever seen, requires more compute than anything ever. And the irony is it's to make your products feel more human. And I think what I'm watching is a proliferation of, if I were to predict the future, a proliferation of interacting with devices in a way that feels very human. Like if you watch my 15-year-old, she talks to her phone all the time. She does not type anything into chat, right? She's just talking to chat like it's a person. And so what I'm really interested in, though, is where is that a great solution versus where does the human really matter? Because I had an experience where I went into a big box. I asked the person in front of me, can you help me find X, Y, or Z? They looked it up in their own generative AI tool and then just like pointed where to go. And I was like, oh, that's not the interaction I wanted. Like I wanted you to talk to me and tell me about it. And so I think for consumer brands, it's a really interesting world to try to discern who's doing interesting things in the space, but also who is doubling down on those real personal interactions and where and why.
We've been talking about such a period of uncertainty, unevenness, et cetera. What are the skills that are needed to be a CEO through all of this?
Oh my goodness. This idea of unlearning and relearning is one of the most important. I mean, look, as CEOs, none of us, I think, very few of us at least, graduated in a degree with advanced AI anywhere around our title, right? It's true. And so having a willingness to do that. The second is, it sounds trite, but boy, does it matter now. Surround yourself with people way smarter than you, like way smarter than you. And then the third that has to be a corollary of that then is don't be afraid to ask for help. I ask my board all the time for help. I ask my team for help. And so what you're trying to create, again, back to this resiliency point, it can't be about you as the CEO. I stood in front of my team and I was talking about culture and I said, our culture isn't our culture because I told you it's going to be so. Our culture is our culture because you've decided this is the culture that matters here. And so when I first came in the job, like 6.5 years ago, I tried to define what I thought the role of the CEO was. And my definition was to create the conditions for other amazing leaders to execute the strategy with urgency. And for me, that's more relevant today than it was even when I walked in those 6 years ago. So I think it's more having the humility every day you wake up to say, there's a bunch of stuff that happened in the last 24 hours that I need to like get smarter about. And I need a whole team of people and all of their best superpowers in order to keep this thing going.
Has how you do that changed in the past 6.5 years? How do you create those conditions? Is that different today?
I think any CEO would tell you the CEO they are 6 years into the job is wildly different than the CEO they were 1 year into the job. All of us feel that, right? Like there is a confidence that comes from just sitting in the chair. That being said, I still wake up nervous every day. I wake up in a good way. Like what else has happened? What else do I need to learn? Where are we behind? And so, yes, I think there's a level of confidence you get in terms of surrounding yourself with the right people. And of course, over that time, I've also had a chance to continue to refine the board and the people I surround myself with, which means you just wake up with a different level of like excitement to go do this work with the people around you.
Yeah. Did we have any other questions for Corie? Oh, we have one right up here.
Because if you're going to do tariffs, you need a fun team of people.
Hi, Corie. I'm Marisa Andrada. I'm curious about what it is that you've had to unlearn.
Yeah, I mean, so many things. Like in our case, let's the traditional bricks and mortar retailer is very good at creating an SOP, standard operating procedure, and then we push the SOP out over 1,000 stores, and everybody is judged based on the SOP, right? We have, again, 85,000 people who are used to doing work that way. And all of a sudden, we wake up one day and we need massively more flexibility. We need empowered general managers who know how to meet the needs of their particular consumer. We need different operating models. I mean, as we came out of COVID that year, we had, I think when we look back, 187 different operating models that we put in place. You can't mandate those with SOPs. You have to completely rethink the way that you're going to market. Or in a digitally native economy, how are people really, how are they going to search? Where are they going to look for the product? How do we just embrace the fact that the store plays a completely different role and lead all our decision-making for people like me who never go into a store and only shop digitally? Like the examples are almost limitless. And what's fascinating to me is they happen almost every day. Something has changed, and we have to kind of unlearn our traditional way of doing it and think differently about how we'll meet the consumer.
Great question. So 2 years ago, you coined the term funflation for how consumers were spending.
Yeah.
They were going to the Eras Tour, spending a lot of money on Taylor Swift tickets. They were not buying big electronics and big home purchases. Do you have a word for what consumers are doing today?
Oh, I got in trouble last time for the funflation Taylor Swift thing, so I don't think I'm gonna.
In trouble with who?
I'm just kidding. It got a lot of press. I actually think what's trickier right now is that it's a very individualized consumer experience. I mean, we sold more laptops in Q2 of this year than we have in 15 years. So you just can't, I think this is the hardest part about your question about metrics, all pointing different directions. When there is innovation, when there's something, I mean, we had lines around every one of our buildings for a Switch 2 launch. And this is in a world where people could pre-order, they knew they had it, and they were still in lines at midnight because they wanted that personal experience to get a $500 gaming console. This bifurcation of how the customer is reacting and acting, I think, is one of the new challenges of retail. And I guess if there was ever a word, it's not a very interesting one, but this is just an individualized time. The hardest part about being in retail right now is you need to meet every single individual's need across an amazing assortment, and you need to do it seamlessly across every channel. And that the team would love for me to say, like, this channel at this time is the most important, and that's never how it's going to work again.
That sounds kind of like an impossible task. Is that possible to do?
I absolutely think it's possible. The question is, what is the core of your decision making? Sometimes people will ask me, like, how are you using AI? What's your AI strategy? And I'm very clear that it's not strategy of AI. It is, what does the customer behavior look like? And then how do we use all the tools at our disposal to help the customer? And if you keep the customer at the center of every decision that you're trying to make, I do think, and then you trust people to go make good decisions across touch points, to use AI to measure whether or not those decisions are actually working the way that you thought across touch points. Like, there are more tools than there have ever been to actually understand the efficacy of your actions as it relates to individuals. And I think as you put that infrastructure in place, that's what creates a really resilient company that moves as fast as the customer and as technology.
Thank you so much, Corie, for such a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
America's courts are facing scrutiny like never before, with the increased use of emergency rulings, a president challenging the boundaries of executive power, and half of Americans having a negative opinion of the Supreme Court, according to a recent Pew Research Center survey. What does all this mean for business leaders and the U.S. economy? And how do we, as a country, go about rebuilding public trust in our legal system? Here to discuss all this and more, please welcome Erin E. Murphy, a partner at Clement Murphy, where she is recognized as a leading Supreme Court and appellate advocate, Elizabeth Prelogar, a partner at Cooley LLP and a former Solicitor General of the United States. They will chat with Michal Lev-Ram. Please welcome them.
having you explain a little bit more about your respective backgrounds and roles. I think we're really in for a treat here, having one person who has argued cases within the government on behalf of the government and one outside of the government, and really looking forward to diving into this very light topic that we have in front of us. But let's start with your backgrounds and what it is that you do and have done.
Sure. So, hi, I'm delighted to be here. I'm Elizabeth Prelogar, and I'm currently the chair of the Supreme Court and Appellate practice at Cooley LLP. But I recently wrapped a long tenure in government where I was the Solicitor General of the United States, and in that role, responsible for supervising all of the government's Supreme Court litigation. I've argued 35 cases in the Supreme Court and have had, I think, something of a front row seat to some of the major developments in the law over the past 4 or 5 years.
Great. Erin?
Hi, so I am in private practice at a firm I co-founded called Clement Murphy, where we focus principally on Supreme Court and appellate litigation, just kind of completely generalist. I've actually been in private practice pretty much my entire career, with the exception of a fellowship for a year at the beginning of it. So I've had a lot of really interesting opportunities to kind of see things from, we have a wide variety of clients, so we've actually even represented governmental clients and such, but certainly do a lot of work for businesses across a lot of different issues, because things pop up that seem more traditional, or sometimes you have fascinating constitutional issues and such pop up in the course of your everyday jobs.
Great. All right, we are here to talk about how the courts are shaping business, and I want to ask both of you, what would you say has been the most consequential case, consequential decision of either the 2024 to 25 Supreme Court term, or if you would rather pick a case from the current term that's coming up? Like, what are business leaders in the room here going to still be talking about and thinking about 5 years out? Everything?
It's kind of a trick question, I think, because there isn't just one decision. I think that actually the most significant change in the court's jurisprudence that will very much affect business leaders continuing into the future have been a series of decisions in the administrative law space about how courts will interpret statutes and how courts will understand agency authority. So there was a case in recent terms called Loper-Bright, where the court overruled a longstanding Chevron deference doctrine and basically changed some of the ground rules in understanding agency authority. There have been a series of cases implicating something called the major questions doctrine. That's a principle the court has applied that essentially says if an agency is doing something big and bold and that has significant economic and political consequences, then it has to point to a very clear source of authority. And there have been several cases in recent terms that have challenged some of the structure of administrative agencies. And so if I could change the question slightly, I would say it's the combination of these decisions that have really started to reshape the administrative state, and I think created a lot of opportunities for business leaders to think strategically about their options going forward when they're facing regulation that ultimately they think falls outside an agency's authority.
Yeah, and I really couldn't agree more. I mean, there's all sorts of cases that are extremely consequential to society at large that the court has been dealing with and will deal with again this term, things dealing with voting rights, LGBT rights, all sorts of policy issues. But I think the core issue where we've seen the court actually get involved that's highly consequential to the business community is, as Elizabeth said, the administrative law front. Conversely, an issue that matters a great deal to a lot of folks in the business world that the court just seems anxious to get really into is a lot of things dealing with class action, things dealing with cross-border jurisdiction. How do you, as a national, a business, are you subject to jurisdiction in every state across the country in the same way you are where your company is based? All of those issues that are extremely core to so many of our clients that focus on how do you determine how you can certify a class, what do we have to face for all that? The court kind of keeps dancing around them. Last year they had a case up and they ended up just deciding not to decide the case that would have been really important for understanding the scope of class action stuff. So a lot of those issues, we keep trying, but the court seems a little less, they're much more interested in these issues of administrative law that kind of implicate more structural rules about the powers of administrative agencies vis-a-vis Congress and the executive.
Okay. I want to ask you about the upcoming tariffs case specifically, since that has been so top of mind, and Supreme Court will hear this in November. Beyond just the the question of what's next for tariffs, how will they ultimately be implemented, assuming they still will be. I think there's a broader question here about the boundaries of executive power, whether the courts are an adequate check on those powers. So how should people in the room be thinking about this? And again, both the kind of more immediate question and the broader one.
So I think the tariffs case is one of the most significant cases that the court has granted this term. And it's obviously significant because of the policy and the potential reshaping of the global economy if the tariffs are permitted to take effect. But it's also the next test case in the line I mentioned before about the major questions doctrine, because the argument for those who are challenging the tariffs is that this is an enormously consequential decision to essentially impose tariffs on every other country in the world is something that is quite economically and politically significant, and all of the public attention focused on this, I think, fortifies that conclusion. So the question then becomes, is this a case where the court is going to say, Congress has to clearly authorize this, and it hasn't done so? And I'll say at the outset of this litigation, I think the conventional wisdom among Supreme Court and appellate lawyers was that there was a very good chance the tariffs would be invalidated, and the lower courts to date have agreed that this is beyond the president's authority. But I think the critical thing to focus on is that the tariffs have been permitted to take effect, and so it's changed the status quo. And I think against that backdrop, it creates a hard question for the court in whether it wants to strike down the president's signature economic policy. So we'll be looking for tea leaves from the oral argument, which is coming up in just a few weeks. But I think that there is reason to think that even if the tariffs had never been able to take effect, now that they have come in and changed the status quo, the court might ultimately really have pause and concern before disrupting the president's economic policy in this way.
Yeah, and if you think back just, one of the kind of famous or infamous, however you want to think about it, Supreme Court cases was years ago in the NFIB case where the court was presented with the chance to strike down what was kind of the signature, part of President Obama's administration at the time, and they kind of blinked. And it just shows that the reality is that they are people, they understand the practical implications of their cases they take, and they are steering them in the face. If you read the government's brief in this case, which begins with a lengthy discussion of you will destroy the world if you invalidate the power here. But the other thing that's an interesting dynamic about the case that I think just situates it against some of what Elizabeth was talking about is, on the one hand, this administration is very much on board with the idea of curbing agency authority and curbing that power of administrative agencies and wanting to push back on those have real structural constraints on that. But the arguments you see here is coming from the administration are, it's quite different when it's the president acting directly, and there should be a difference in the way the law thinks about executive action coming from the executive, as opposed to executive action coming under the guise of an administrative agency that's not entirely controlled by the executive. And that's really how you kind of square the circle in these cases where you have, on the one hand, the administration saying kind of we want to shrink all of the government power and we want to constrain the agencies, but we look at things very differently when, as here, it's the president acting directly and claiming to have authority that's given to the executive itself.
By the way, the prediction site Polymarket is currently where I go to for all my answers. Currently says there's a 42% chance that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the Trump tariff. So just for what it's worth, if anyone
put it
wants
up
to
a
put
little
money
bit,
on it.
I'd say.
I think this is, just...
They've been right about a lot of things. So there's that. Just taking a step back here, and I do want to take a question or two from the audience, so please be thinking of any questions you might have. But taking a step back, we're talking about all of these executive orders, this kind of testing the boundaries of executive power that we've seen over the last months. And can you provide a bit of historical context? Because this is not the first time. This is not totally unprecedented. So give us a little bit of historical context. What have we seen in the past? Where does this kind of net out based on what we know?
So I think it's absolutely right to say that, of course, as a historical matter, there's nothing unique about the president taking action and the courts having to resolve ultimately whether that falls within the president's authority. And it's, all the way back to Marbury versus Madison, where the court declared its power of judicial review and its authority to say what the law means. I think what's unique about this current moment in history is the pace at which massive issues are making their way to the court, and the narrative that's building around that there's some kind of constitutional battle brewing about the respective spheres of authority for the president and for the court itself. To my mind, there are really two root causes of the current state of affairs. One of them is that Congress, which is ordinarily one of the major checks on the president's own authority, has largely not been playing in this space or taking its own action to try to suggest that the president is acting outside a proper sphere. And so that means that Congress has essentially removed itself from the debate, and all of the burden of assessing this, therefore, falls on the court itself. The other thing I would say is that through a unique combination of the kind of authority that some lower courts have claimed with respect to the breadth of their remedies and the way that litigation has been unfolding as a procedural matter, cases are making their way to the court far more quickly than they ordinarily do. And a lot of that is happening on the court's emergency docket. Some refer to it as the shadow docket. Odds are you've heard about some of the major cases that have been litigated and resulted in decisions on that docket in recent months. And I think that means that we're facing a situation where the court is being asked to weigh in on the president's claim of authority in a very rushed posture, in an emergency posture, where it has very little briefing, not as much time for process, and where there hasn't been full percolation of those legal issues in the lower courts. So to my mind, it kind of creates a perfect storm of feeding this narrative that we are historically in unprecedented times vis-a-vis the court facing off the president.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on the last point Elizabeth was making. There's a lot of focus and critique about the court taking these cases as if it's them doing them in kind of reaching out and doing something in an emergency posture, but a lot of it is generated by the way that cases are treated in the lower courts. Because the lower courts have been treating them as these are emergency cases that we have to resolve extremely quickly on ourselves, a pretty limited record, and then we're going to set a rule that's really going to govern if the appellate courts or Supreme Court don't step in for quite some time, and could have extraordinary effects, especially as we're still working through what exists still in terms of broader nationwide type injunctive relief in cases. And so I think that dynamic, a lot of people kind of view it as, why is the court reaching out and taking these cases? But the reality is the cases are showing up to them in a posture that makes it very difficult for them to say, we're just going to do nothing. And for as many cases as the administration is bringing, like the majority of them, they're not bringing. So there's a real chicken and egg kind of dynamic to trying to assess how we got ourselves to this point where the court is dealing with so many things on an emergency docket. But of course, some of it is also just a product of, and this is just an observation, not a critique in one way or another, that this is an administration that wanted to do a lot of things very quickly and do a fair amount of them through executive action. And that just tees things up to be challenged in ways. It takes a lot longer to kind of go through. We're challenging a statute. We're challenging a rule that, an agency takes years to put out a rule. So that kind of litigation inherently operates more slowly than when you have an administration that operates through a lot of executive orders. And I think when you were Solicitor General, a lot of your emergency cases arose also out of postures where things were happening through more executive orders than through, statutory legislation type paths.
And just to clarify, so the emergency docket or shadow docket, whatever you want to call it, that we're talking about, so the difference is there, they're moving through faster, it's not the normal process. There's also less transparency, right? Would you not agree there?
It sort of depends. Like, that was a critique for quite some time, that the nature of that docket was that the court often just kind of said, like, we grant relief or we deny it, and didn't say a lot. And then everybody critiqued them for a while and said, why are you keeping this in the shadows? Nobody's telling us what you're thinking. So they started now putting out opinions, and they explain what they're thinking. And now everybody's kind of critiquing them from the other side and saying, you shouldn't be making all this law when you haven't had a lot of time to read the briefs. What are you doing? And it's like, we can't win. Yeah. So I think there's actually seems to be, to me, one thing I'm watching this term is to see if the court cuts back closer to where it used to be on how much they actually discuss what they're doing on the emergency docket as opposed to just sort of grant or deny relief. But what they have been doing a lot of is what I think of as pulling cases out of the shadows, off of the docket. They say, okay, we're going to deal with the immediate question of whether to grant or deny relief like today, but we're also, as with tariffs, going to set this case for argument in 2 months to give us a little bit of time to get some real briefings, sit down, and make more of the kind of decision we would normally make.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about the emergency docket is it actually is a situation, as Erin was just touching on, where I think you see the court being responsive to what's out in the public narrative. There was a lot of criticism of what the court was doing on that docket, and in particular, people would say these are massively consequential cases. At the emergency stage, you're only deciding the interim state of affairs. So what will the rules be on the ground while the case is proceeding? But in many instances, the interim state of affairs is the whole ballgame and is going to have enormous consequence for our society and the rules we're living under for a substantial period of time. And so I think the court responded to people expressing concern about making these very enormous decisions on the basis of incomplete process and started picking these cases off the emergency docket, trying to get a little more time to think with more deliberation and potentially yield a fully reasoned opinion.
I have about 100 more questions for you, but I do want to give a chance to the audience. Does anybody have a quick question? Okay. There's a microphone coming over to you if you could introduce yourself real quick.
Hi, Heather White, Chief Legal Officer of Genpact. I just wanted to make sure that I heard you correctly, that your guess is that they will uphold the tariffs because they've already been in place, and so rolling them back would be very disruptive. Could you explain that more? Because doesn't that mean that they could just put anything in, and if it's gone effective, you can't undo it?
Sure. And I should be careful to say that I think that this case is almost a coin toss. I think it really could reasonably go either way. But the reason I emphasize the fact that the tariffs have been allowed to take effect is it's given the government an argument that at this point it would be incredibly disruptive to try to unscramble those eggs, essentially. You know, the government is coming to court and saying, we would have to unwind billions or trillions of dollars. It could bankrupt our nation. It's money that we wouldn't have accessible and that will come at great cost. And I think that that is going to make several justices think twice about invalidating this policy. And there's enough in the statute, the authorities the president has invoked. There's enough in this foreign affairs and kind of national security context for the court to latch onto. But I think my real intuition here is that the justices are, of course, supreme, but they're also just human beings. And I think that although they don't always reason from some of these practical consequences, they can't help but take them into account in the background. I take the point of the concern, though, that of course, if this meant that any time a policy takes effect, there's a large thumb on the scale to suggest it gets to continue in effect, that would be a big problem for a legal rule. I don't think the court would say anything as broad or sweeping as that. It's just that in this distinct context, with this signature policy and a government claim of a true emergency, the court might think there's enough here to let the president do it.
Well, I wanted to end on a more hopeful note than tariffs. Not that there's anything unhopeful about tariffs, of course, but we are out of time. Thank you so much. I know we only scratched the surface, but I hope we have you both back. And it's lovely to have such a critical conversation with two very insightful and knowledgeable and level-headed factual people. So thank you so much. Thank you. I guess we can go out this way.